In the damp silence of an island wrapped in mist, there lay a land of eternal green and ancestral legends. Ireland, at the end of the 16th century, was a territory as beautiful as it was divided. With its dense forests, gentle hills and fields crossed by quiet streams, it appeared to those approaching from the sea as a place born from ancient tales. But behind the calm beauty, there was tension. A silent tension, like the sky about to collapse into rain over the cold stones of a forgotten village. At that time, Ireland was still a patchwork of autonomous lordships, ancient clans, and regions governed by their own traditions. The power of the Gaelic kings, though fragmented, was still acknowledged by the people of the interior. The laws were not those of the English crown, but the Brehon laws, an ancient oral legal system rooted in compensation, honor, and collective harmony. In these lands, justice was not enforced by armies, but passed down by poets, elders, and sacred judges. It was a spiritual island, steeped in ritual, where words carried the weight of iron and oaths were stronger than any sword. Gaelic families lived around their tribal leaders. Each clan had its own territory, its own story, its own song. The castles were modest, but rich in symbolism. The hills held the bones of the ancestors. And the fire burning in the center of the round houses was more than warmth. It was memory. On stormy nights, bards told by torchlight stories of Cú Chulainn, the Fianna, and the resistance of the first Irish warriors. Tales of honor, bravery, and destiny, repeated across generations like pagan prayers before an uncertain future. But it was not a land at peace. Over the years, English presence, once confined to the outskirts of Dublin, in the region known as the Pale, began to stretch like a persistent shadow across the island. The English feudal system, with its mapped properties, growing bureaucracy, and Anglican faith met resistance in the forests, in the monasteries, and in the hearts of the people. It was as if two ways of existing were silently colliding, one structured and expansionist, the other tribal, spiritual, rooted in the land like ancient roots. The tension grew year by year. Gaelic lords saw their titles threatened. Catholic monks were persecuted. Clan chiefs were pressured to swear loyalty to a distant crown. In every village, every valley, every peninsula, the sense of something approaching could be felt. An outside force, not just armies, but a way of life slowly crushing the local traditions. England was not just occupying Ireland with soldiers, it was trying to replace it in spirit. In the north, however, an ancestral flame still burned. The province of Ulster, more isolated, resisted more fiercely. There, the most powerful clans, the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, the Maguires, held their authority nearly untouched. Their fortresses were built from stone and pride. Their warriors trained in fog-covered fields, and their leaders knew that sooner or later they would have to choose between submission or war. It is in this landscape of calm beauty and growing tension that the figure of Hugh O'Neill emerges, a man destined to be the bridge and the chasm between two worlds. An Irishman raised among the English, a landowner torn between ancestral honor and modern politics. His story does not begin with cries of rebellion, but with silence. A thick silence, like the sky before thunder, like the fog that blankets the hills of Tyrone before the first step toward war. And so, with Ireland divided in both spirit and land, the sound of rain falling on thatched roofs seems to whisper to attentive ears that something is about to begin. Not a single battle, but a long journey of resistance, identity, and loss. The 9 Years' War has not yet begun, but hearts are already marching. Long before the drums of war echoed through the hills of Ulster, a slow and nearly invisible process was already unfolding. The presence of the English crown in Ireland did not begin with drawn swords, but with documents, alliances, and small concessions. It crept along the margins of power, seeping into local structures like the tide that slowly encircles the stones until it drowns them. At first, it seemed like mere administration. Then, it became occupation. In the end, it was a new world attempting to swallow the old. In the 12th century, the first Normans arrived in Ireland. They came with papal authorization and the blessing of King Henry II. It was the beginning of a tense and unequal relationship that would last for centuries. The first Anglo-Norman lords did not seek to destroy the local culture, but instead blended into it, marrying into Gaelic families and adopting their traditions. For a long time, there was a kind of irregular coexistence, a dance between conquest and assimilation. But as time passed, England grew more centralized and Ireland more resistant. The true transformation began with the Tudors. Henry VIII, obsessed with total control over his lands, broke with Rome and demanded not only political but also religious loyalty. The Anglican Reformation crossed the Irish Sea like thunder. The Irish lords, Catholic by faith and tradition, came to be seen with suspicion. Religious disobedience became synonymous with treason, and faith, once lived among monasteries and countryside masses, suddenly became an act of rebellion. Elizabeth I, as daughter of Henry and a monarch with a mind sharp as a dagger, intensified the process. Her administration sent educated men, cartographers, military commanders, and advisors to reorganize Ireland as an English province. It was the birth of the Higher Colonization Project, known as the Higher Plantations, which would transform ancestral lands into properties granted to loyal subjects of the Queen. Each new estate was an invisible wound in the soul of an ancient island. Forests were cut down, villages were reshaped, monasteries dissolved, forts were erected in sacred places, small stone churches were converted into Protestant chapels. What had once been familiar became foreign. What had once been a symbol of continuity became a mark of rupture. The resistance was fragmented. Some lords submitted to retain their titles and lands. Others fought in silence, sheltering clandestine monks and protecting traditions. The threatened Irish culture began to take refuge in orality, in songs, in symbols. For every English law, a new story was told around the fire. For every prohibition, a new poem was whispered in the woods. Ireland did not yet respond with open war, but with memory, with faith, and with patience. English control expanded in widening circles. Around Dublin, the region known as the Pale was considered secure and fully under the Crown's control. But beyond those boundaries, power grew thin. Negotiations with clans were necessary, as were the suppression of sporadic uprisings and the gaining of respect, or fear, of powerful regional lords. Among them, Hugh O'Neill emerged as one of the most promising. O'Neill was, at once, a product of English strategy and a living threat to its success. Educated under the Crown's guardianship, fluent in English and the language of court diplomacy, he seemed the model of a loyal Irish lord. But beneath the fine clothes and the title of Earl, Hugh was also the grandson of warriors, son of the hills, and heir to the pride of the O'Neills, one of Ireland's oldest and most revered families. Thus, the English presence was never solely military. It was psychological, religious, political, a slow, painful, and calculated project of replacement. While London saw progress and order, the Irish felt invasion and loss. With every new English castle, every new Protestant school, the earth seemed to cry out, not in words, but in that thick silence that precedes the turning points of history. And so, with Ireland increasingly surrounded, yet still standing, the stage was set. England had planted its flags, Ireland its sorrows, and amid that fertile field of grievances, the fire of war would soon rise, not as a sudden explosion, but like hidden embers beneath the damp leaves of the forest. Hugh O'Neill, who had learned from the English, would soon face them with his own wisdom, and the Green Island would plunge into the longest and most devastating war in its history. Before his name became a symbol of resistance, before his sword led armies through the forests of Ulster, Hugh O'Neill was merely a child between worlds. His birth, around 1550, took place during one of Ireland's most uncertain moments, an ancestral land increasingly subdued, a resilient people increasingly divided. The blood running through his veins belonged to one of the most ancient and honoured Gaelic lineages, the O'Neills of Tyrone, direct descendants of Celtic kings, lords of the northern plains. But the path laid before him would lead elsewhere. Very young, Hugh was taken from his homeland and placed under English custody in a political manoeuvre typical of turbulent times. Educate the enemy's heir to secure future obedience. Under the Crown's supervision, he was raised in Dublin, at the heart of English power in Ireland. Instead of hearing bards sing ancestral glories by the fire, Hugh listened to the bells of Anglican churches. Instead of walking through forests and plains, he wandered stone corridors and symmetrical gardens. His childhood was not one of roots but of transplantation. He was taught to read and write in English. He learned courtly etiquette, European-style military strategy, and the doctrines of Protestantism. In the eyes of Elizabeth I's administration, he was a success. The Gaelic lord converted to reason, a bridge between wilderness and civilization. But within Hugh, a deep ambiguity grew, like a river split by an invisible rock. He mastered the language of the conquerors, but dreamed in Gaelic. He could negotiate with nobles, but his spirit belonged to the warriors of the hills. He was not English, and slowly he realized he was no longer an ordinary Irishman either. This estrangement became more evident as he grew older. In official meetings, Hugh O'Neill embodied the hope of a pacified Ireland, integrated into the crown. But in lonely nights, he likely asked himself where he truly came from. He knew the rituals of the clans, the stories of his ancestors, the customs his English tutors called barbaric. He understood that his lineage demanded more than good manners. It demanded honor, protection, and, if necessary, sacrifice. As an adult, he was granted the title of Earl of Tyrone, officially recognized by the crown. It gave him political prestige and the appearance of consolidated power. But the reality was different. Hugh ruled a land that was no longer his own, in the name of a monarchy that did not understand its history. With every new order from Dublin, he had to reconcile the English will with the loyalty of the clans. With every new demand, the tension inside him deepened. The tribal chiefs viewed him with suspicion. Many called him a traitor, a servant of the invaders. Others, more hopeful, saw in him a bridge, someone who could understand both sides negotiate lasting peace. But no one truly knew what Hugh thought. He was like the mists of Ulster, dense, difficult to decipher, always shifting. Meanwhile, in the villages, the winds of revolt were gaining strength. Peasants were being expelled from their lands, monks were persecuted, and traditions were slowly being erased. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that Hugh reunited with Hugh O'Donnell, his future ally. A young lord from another powerful clan, the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell. Both had suffered at the hands of England, one through forced education, the other through imprisonment. Both felt the invisible loss of identity, and both knew that silent submission was becoming unsustainable. What united them was not only the past, but the growing sense that something precious was being torn away, from their land, from their families, from their spirits. Hugh O'Neill had not yet drawn his sword against the crown. He still attended councils, still signed letters with English formality, but within him, the seed of rebellion was taking root like moss on the ancient stone walls of the fortresses. Slowly, silently, deeply. He understood the codes of the enemy, and that would one day be his greatest weapon. For unlike many who rose in impulsive fury, Hugh planned like a general, observed like a diplomat, and suffered like a son torn in two. That is why his story is so unique. Hugh O'Neill did not fight only armies. He fought himself. He fought what the English tried to make of him. He fought what the Irish expected him to be. And he fought against time, for he knew the window for freedom was closing. When he finally rose against England, it would not be on impulse, it would be by choice. A bitter choice born of decades of silence and loss. A choice that would forever change Ireland and mark the end of the old order. At the time, few knew it. But the boy raised on English books was about to become Dewey, the last great Gaelic lord. And his war would not be only for land, but for memory. Not every war begins with the roar of cannons or the flash of swords. Some begin in silence, between whispers and light footsteps on the morning dew. In late 16th century Ireland, the first sign of rebellion was not a frontal attack, but a collective sigh rising from the villages, the forests, and the riverbanks. It was the muffled sound of a people resisting in secret, and before the world knew that the 9 years' war had begun, many acts of courage had already been buried beneath the mist of the mountains. In the most remote regions of Ulster and Connaught, men and women began to organize beyond the sight of English administrators. They gathered at night, under the shelter of ancient oaks, in clearings where the echoes of old stories still seemed alive. There were no treaties or proclamations there, only the weight of ancestry and the certainty that something had to be done. The first signs of resistance emerged in fragmented ways. An English convoy ambushed on a road, a fort attacked in the dead of night, a priest hiding from house to house, offering the forbidden mass. Small acts that, together, formed the roots of an uprising. These early sparks of conflict were not led by great armies, but by local clans who knew the land like the lines on their hands. The geography of Ireland, with its moss-covered hills, rain-soaked valleys, and hidden trails among the trees, made every English advance a struggle, and every Irish ambush nearly invisible. It was a war of shadow against light, of ancient paths against newly drawn roads. The English had maps, but the Irish had memory. In many cases, the violence was silent. A patrol vanished. A castle was abandoned without explanation. An English commander was found dead by a stream, with no witnesses. The London press barely took notice. Official reports spoke of local unrest, undisciplined barbarians, regional disturbances. But in the villages, a different fire burned. It wasn't only about defending land, it was spiritual. Every act of resistance was a way to keep alive an Ireland being erased by laws, edicts, and imposed religion. There was also the question of faith. As England reinforced Anglicanism, the Catholic Irish, increasingly persecuted, saw their religion as a symbolic trench. The Christianity they had embraced for over 1,000 years was now forbidden, monitored, restricted. Secret masses were held on the hillsides, known as mass rocks, sacred stones where priests, under threat of death, celebrated ancient liturgies. Children were baptized in hidden streams. Entire families learned to pray in silence, as if guarding a sacred secret. And the priests, those messengers of a forbidden time, became symbols of resistance themselves. Amid this smothered tension, alliances began to form. Clans that had been rivals for decades, such as the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, the Maguires, began exchanging messages, gathering in councils and forging silent pacts. What united them was not only Gaelic identity, but the shared certainty that they were all being slowly consumed by the same enemy. It was a union forged not by ambition but by necessity, by survival. Hugh O'Neill at that moment still maintained his ambiguous position. Officially loyal to the crown, he watched the clan's movements with sharp eyes but said little. He waited, observed, measured the risks. He knew that a poorly planned revolt would bring total destruction, but he also sensed that the time for hesitation was ending. Ireland was waking up, and the unrest that had once been scattered now had a name, a face, and a cause. The landscape, once marked by quiet woods and gentle streams, began to change. Makeshift fortifications rose between the hills. Villages secretly armed themselves. Blacksmiths, once devoted to farming tools, returned to forging blades. Women taught children songs of bravery while hiding food beneath the floorboards. The entire country seemed to breathe more heavily, as if it knew deep in its soul that the days of peace were over. And then, on a cold dawn in the year 1594, a small English outpost was attacked. It was the fort at Enniskillen, in the province of Fermanagh. The soldiers were killed, the English flag was torn down, and the silence was broken. The news spread like wind across the damp fields. Something had changed. It was no longer just resistance, it was war. Still timid, still unnamed, but alive. From that moment on, the path toward total conflict was set. O'Neill would draw closer to his former rivals. The English would strengthen their military presence, and Ireland, steeped in centuries of memory, prepared to write in blood and in earth the most intense chapter of its long and sorrowful history. Ireland has always been a land of clans. For centuries, its green hills echoed, not only with the songs of bards and the bells of churches, but also with the disputes between powerful families, the temporary pacts, and the age-old rivalries that defined the island's delicate balance. Each clan was a world of its own, with its customs, its territory, its Christian saints and pagan traditions blended by time. But now, on the brink of an inevitable war, something unprecedented began to happen. Ancient enemies looked each other in the eye and extended their hands. The threat of England was no longer a distant shadow. It was a tangible presence, seen in stone fortresses, in imposed laws, in priests forced into hiding, and in the cold ovens of destroyed monasteries. It was the hand that tore ancestral lands away and turned them into property of the crown. It was the voice that commanded, in another language, for the children of Ireland to bow. And in the face of that reality, the clans began to understand what their bards had been reciting for centuries in verse. Only united could they survive. It was Hugh O'Neill who first recognized the precise moment to act. Until then, he had walked the thin line between submission and dissatisfaction. He knew that rising against the Queen meant risking everything: titles, lands, his life and that of his people. But he also knew that remaining passive was to sign the slow death of all that still remained of the old Ireland. The decision, when it came, was not explosive. It was quiet, like a stone carefully placed in the foundation of something greater. O'Neill began sending messengers, at first discreetly, then with greater resolve. The main targets were his former rivals, the O'Donnells, lords of Tyrconnell, and the Maguires, protectors of Fermanagh. Their shared history was marked by bloody battles and border disputes. But now, a new kind of conversation took place under the veil of night, in hidden caves among mountains and rivers. It was as if the elements of the earth themselves whispered that the time for division had ended. The most symbolic meeting took place in Donegal, in the heart of the north. There, beneath the stone roof of a Gaelic castle, the leaders of the great families gathered. It wasn't a formal conference like those held in London or Dublin. It was something more ancient, a circle of men hardened by life, with eyes that had seen both loss and victory, and voices heavy with the weight of generations. Around a hearth, they discussed not only strategies, but the future of Ireland's soul. Hugh O'Neill, young and fervent, embodied the indomitable spirit of the O'Donnells. Captured as a teenager by the English, he had escaped from a frozen prison in Dublin in an act of courage that would become legend. He hated English rule with every fibre of his being. O'Neill, older, more political, more composed, carried within him calculation, patience, and deep knowledge of the enemy. Together they formed an unlikely, yet necessary, duo. One was fire, the other strategy. Other clans joined the cause, the MacMahons, the O'Reillys, the O'Rourkes. Each new alliance was a step toward war. But more than that, it was the recovery of collective identity. For the first time in centuries, the clans spoke with a single voice, and that voice, still whispered, was beginning to be heard across the island. This union was not just military, it was symbolic. Agreements were forged on ancestral traditions, oaths sworn over swords driven into the earth, promises sealed with river water and altar wine. The Catholic faith united them. The shared memory united them. The looming loss united them. And beneath the soft glow of torches, the eyes of those men, many of them marked by old wounds, shone with something rare: hope. From that moment on, the attacks ceased to be isolated. They became coordinated. English forts began to fall in succession. Irish troops, trained by veterans of the war in Flanders, emerged as near-professional armies. Men who once defended only their own valleys now marched through entire forests in the name of the island itself. There was a cause, there was a plan, there was command, and there was faith. The villages, sensing the wind of change, began to collaborate more closely. Women hid weapons beneath barns, children watched the roads, elders passed down forgotten knowledge of trails, healing herbs, and signs in the weather. The country, slowly, was becoming a single body, wounded but alive. The alliance of clans, forged between ancient wounds and future threats, was more than a political pact. It was an act of resurrection. Ireland, for the first time in generations, rose not as fragments of land and family names, but as a nation. And in this new form, more dangerous than any sword, it marched toward war. There are moments in history when time seems to stop, as if the trees hold back the wind, the rivers slow their course, and the crows fall silent, waiting. In Ireland, in the year 1595, the world felt suspended. The pacts had been sealed, the swords sharpened, the secret routes marked in the forest mud, and in the heart of Ulster, one place began to glow with the heat of decision: Blackwater Fort. Isolated, strategic, small in the eyes of England, but immense to the Irish people, it would become the first stage of a war that would last 9 long years. Blackwater Fort, built by the English along the banks of the river of the same name, was an advanced post, a kind of watchtower looming over O'Neill territory. Its purpose was simple: observe, control, intimidate. But for the Irish, that construction was more than a physical barrier. It was a symbol, a foreign body embedded in the sacred soil of Tyrone, a silent insult that had been tolerated for too long. And now, at last, there would be an answer. The campaign began like a subtle dance among the leaves. Irish troops, guided by the secret paths of the forest, began to surround the fort. They brought no drums, no trumpets. They moved with the rhythm of the rain, the whisper of branches, the cadence of silence. Hugh O'Neill, meticulous and strategic, led his men like a living game of chess, placing them precisely around the English garrison. The Queen's soldiers, though well armed, were unprepared for this kind of warfare. They knew the open fields of Flanders, but not the thick mist of Irish mornings. The siege was patient. Days turned to weeks. The English, now encircled, began to feel the strain. Food supplies grew scarce. Communication with Dublin became unreliable. Meanwhile, the Irish dug, chopped, built hidden encampments, tightening the noose not with haste, but with purpose. It was as if the earth itself conspired to close the circle. The river, once a supply route, was blocked. The trails, once safe, were now guarded by archers hidden among ferns and moss-covered stones. The first skirmish was brief but revealing. A small English detachment attempted to break out for help. They didn't get far. Intercepted, engaged, and destroyed within minutes. Their bodies were swallowed by the fog, the blood absorbed by the soil. It was the message. The war had begun. In London, the news arrived late, and with disbelief. Hugh O'Neill, the educated lord, the civilized Earl, the good Irishman, had risen up. It was as if a son sworn to the Queen had turned against his own mother. Elizabeth of I was furious, not only at the betrayal, but at the political implications. The siege of Blackwater wasn't just a military action. It was a message. Ireland was standing, and its leadership spoke with one voice. The siege culminated in a coordinated assault. In the early hours of July 14, 1595, the Irish launched a full offensive. The fort's wooden walls were set ablaze. The towers collapsed. The English soldiers, with no escape, tried to resist, but the siege was complete. By dawn, the fort had fallen. The flames still danced on the horizon, reflected in the Blackwater River like orange stars announcing a new day and a new chapter. The impact of the victory ran deep, not just militarily, but psychologically. For the first time, Irish forces had defeated a royal garrison in open combat. For the first time, the world heard and feared the name Hugh O'Neill, not as a diplomatic ally, but as leader of a national rebellion. The war now had a face, a name, a strategy, and a heart. Across Ireland, villages stirred. Clans once hesitant joined the cause. Priests resumed mass in loud voices. Bards composed songs about the fall of the fort. And children born under the weight of occupation heard stories of victory for the first time. The flame had been lit, but Hugh O'Neill, even after the triumph, knew this was only the beginning. England would respond, and with force. The true test still lay ahead. But that night, as cold winds whispered through the smoking ruins of Blackwater, Ireland slept with a quiet smile. The war had begun, but for the first time, it was a war of the Irish. In Ireland, the land breathes. It is not merely soil beneath the feet. It is living memory, hidden ancestry beneath thick moss, an ancient organism that keeps secrets among the trees and whispers warnings through the wind. And it was precisely this land that became the greatest ally of the Irish when the war finally spread. Unlike the open fields and vast plains where armies clash face to face, the stage of the 9 Years' War was made of dense forests, wet hills, sudden fogs, and paths known only to the old. And in this setting, the Queen's soldiers found themselves lost in every sense. The English troops arriving on the island were trained in the discipline of linear formations, in bugles that commanded attacks, in flat terrain where the enemy could be seen clearly. But in Ireland, everything was different. Sight vanished after just a few meters, swallowed by tall canopies and constant mist. Sound was muffled by thick vegetation. And the paths, when they existed at all, seemed to shift with the rain. It was a war without tracks, without symmetry. A war where the enemy appeared from nowhere and vanished like smoke. Hugh O'Neill and his allies knew this, and they used nature as an invisible sword. His soldiers, many raised among trees and rivers, moved in silence. They didn't march, they glided. They didn't shout commands, they signaled with their hands. The ambushes were meticulously prepared. English troops would follow what seemed like a safe trail, until suddenly arrows rained from all sides, followed by short spears, quick strikes, immediate retreats. When the enemy tried to respond, the attackers had already melted into the shadows of the trees. This tactic, now known as guerrilla warfare, was one of the great innovations of the conflict. It was not cowardice, but intelligence. The Irish knew that in open combat, They would be outnumbered, outgunned, undersupplied. But if they chose the battlefield, they could win. And that field was the forest. The narrow rivers, the mountain passes, the hidden bogs. Every stone, every tree, every curve of the land was familiar, and every corner of the territory hid not only traps, but stories. The forests of Ireland, always sacred in Celtic imagination, now became natural fortresses. The sound of rain on leaves was more effective than any war drum. The morning fog served as the perfect ally for unexpected movements, and the cold, damp nights made English encampments unbearable without heavy losses. The nights belonged to the locals, and the days to the doubts of the invaders. Beyond mobility and terrain knowledge, there was also the art of deception. The Irish began using traps with surgical precision, camouflaged pits along trails, horses left behind to lure patrols. Men disguised as monks or peasants. It was a war without uniforms, a conflict where the greatest weapon was uncertainty. English generals began to report in anxious letters that they were fighting ghosts, men who attacked without warning and vanished like thunder. But it wasn't just tactics, it was also culture for the Irish warriors. Fighting this way wasn't just a practical decision, it was an expression of identity. They weren't only defending land, they were defending a way of life. The forest itself was part of the Gaelic soul. There their ancestors had made offerings, there their mothers had given birth, there their bards had sung. Fighting in the shadows was more than survival, it was belonging. Meanwhile, the English tried to adapt. They sent more troops, they mapped trails, built roads where once there had only been brush. But the deeper they advanced, the more they realized the problem wasn't the forest, it was the people. Ireland could not be conquered with weapons alone. To win, they would have to break the spirit of a land that refused to forget, and that cannot be done with gunpowder. In the villages, support for the resistance grew. With every successful ambush, more men joined voluntarily. Women cooked for the fighters. Children watched the roads and carried messages inside bark or folded beneath their tongues. It was as if the whole nation had dissolved into the woods, blended with the green, invisible but alive. For nearly 2 years, this form of combat prevailed, and the results were clear. The English advanced, but at the cost of hundreds of lives. Military reports spoke of rising casualties. Soldiers grew sick in the cold, horses collapsed in the unstable soil, and morale, as the months dragged on, sank like a forgotten banner in the mud. But Hugh O'Neill knew this advantage was fragile. The forests could protect, but they could not win the war alone. The future of the conflict would demand more. It would demand allies. And with eyes turned toward the European continent, he knew who might answer the call of faith and resistance. Spain. Far from the damp forests of Ulster, away from the silent ambushes among moss and stone, another kind of war was unfolding. Colder, more diplomatic, more draped in velvet than in leather. It was the war of papers, of seals, of decrees. A war fought in the corridors of Whitehall, in the chambers of Westminster, and in the perfumed halls of Queen Elizabeth I's court. For many in London, Ireland was a matter of national honour. For others, an irritating stone in the imperial shoe. But to all, one thing was clear. The name Hugh O'Neill now demanded a response. When the first reports of the rebellion reached the English capital, the initial reaction was restrained. Some advisers believed it would be just another brief uprising, like so many others that had already been crushed. But as the reports piled up, revealing the siege of Blackwater, the growing alliance of clans, and above all, the defeat of royal troops at the hands of peasants wielding unconventional tactics, the tone changed. This rebellion was not episodic, it was structural. Elizabeth, the Iron Queen, did not take disobedience lightly. In her eyes, O'Neill was more than a rebel. He was a personal disappointment, someone she had welcomed into the framework of power. A legitimized Earl, a political ally, an example of how Ireland could be molded. Now that same man had risen with a nationalist, Catholic and anti-imperial cause. To her it wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. Emergency meetings were called. Advisers debated deep into the night by the trembling light of candles and torches, surrounded by maps and intercepted messages. O'Neill's name was on every document. Some demanded his capture and execution as an example. Others, more cautious, suggested negotiations, but no one dared to ignore him anymore. Parliament, under pressure from the rising costs of war, approved new taxes, and increased the funds allocated to the Irish campaign. More soldiers were needed, more supplies, more experienced commanders. But every reinforcement carried risk. England was already engaged in conflicts across Europe, especially against Spain. Waging a prolonged war in Ireland could weaken the Crown's international position. The generals sent to Dublin faced unexpected obstacles. Sir William Russell, Sir Henry Bagenal, Sir Conyers Clifford, all men with solid reputations, found themselves defeated or stalled by an irregular army that knew the geography, the weather, and the people like one knows their own body. The English troops marched in perfect columns only to fall into ambushes. They camped with order only to be surprised by the fog. They fought with courage but lost morale with every setback. And as the war dragged on, the costs kept rising. London was beginning to understand that the conflict in Ireland was not a mere regional revolt. It was a national war, driven by ideology, by faith, and by memory. The Queen, increasingly impatient, wrote letters demanding results. She knew her image as an invincible sovereign depended on suppressing this rebellion. An empire that cannot control its islands cannot command respect in the eyes of the world. To contain O'Neill's expansion, the English government ordered the construction of military roads, routes that would cut through rebel territories and allow for rapid troop movement. Forts were erected along these paths, but every mile gained was paid in lives, illness, and exhaustion. The Irish landscape seemed to swallow English armies like a bog swallows a horse, slowly but relentlessly. At the same time, the Queen's envoys tried to divide the Gaelic alliance. They offered titles, pardons, gold. They promised land and protection. But most Irish leaders resisted, because unlike previous uprisings, this was not just a reaction, it was a plan. And its chief architect, Hugh O'Neill, always seemed one step ahead. In the heart of English power, fear was also growing that the rebellion might go international. Rumours of an alliance between the Irish and the Spanish monarchy, England's greatest enemy, set alarms ringing. If the armies of Philip II or his successors were to land on Irish shores, the conflict would take on an entirely new scale. It would become not just an internal war, but a war between empires. Even in the face of these looming threats, the English court maintained an air of control. Banquets continued. Shakespeare's plays were performed. The halls glittered with gold and silk. But behind the curtains, the concern was real. Ireland, that nearby island, so difficult to tame, was challenging everything. The monarchy's authority, the dominance of Protestantism, and the very narrative of Tudor power. Meanwhile, on the Green Island, the Irish remained quiet, strengthening their positions, praying in hidden churches, marching along ancestral trails, and waiting, because they knew the true test was still to come. The confrontation that would decide everything was still on the horizon, but not for long. In the deep silence of ruined churches, among the ashes of pillaged monasteries, and within Latin hymns whispered along the lake shores, Ireland held onto something no English sword could erase. Faith, Catholic faith, a faith that had already survived reformations and persecutions, now became the invisible thread linking the Gaelic rebels to the world beyond the sea. And it was for this faith, more than for political alliances or military calculations, that Hugh O'Neill turned his gaze southward, toward the empire of Philip II, toward the golden altar of the Spanish monarchy. Spain at the end of the 16th century was not just a country. It was a global empire with colonies across the Americas, trade routes spanning oceans, and armadas that had once challenged England itself. Above all, it was the bastion of European Catholicism. While Elizabeth I consolidated the Protestant Reformation in her realm, Philip II presented himself as the armed arm of Rome, the devout king, the defender of the true faith. And in Ireland, where masses were held in secret and priests risked their lives for each sacrament, that Spain became more than a friendly nation. It became a divine promise. O'Neill knew this. Intelligent and strategic, he began sending secret envoys to Madrid and Rome, carrying carefully worded letters filled with religious and geopolitical appeals. He wasn't merely asking for help. He was offering something, a new bastion for Catholicism. He promised that if Ireland were liberated, if the English were expelled, the entire island would become a loyal fortress of the Church, an unconditional ally to the Pope and to the Spanish throne. It was a bold proposal, to turn Ireland into a new front of the Counter-Reformation right beside England. The letters were received with interest. In Madrid, Philip II's court observed O'Neill's moves closely. The defeat of the Spanish Armada just years prior still burned in Spain's memory. But now Ireland seemed to offer a new opportunity, a chance to weaken England without confronting her directly. Geography helped. The island lay just north of Spain. Well-positioned support could shift the balance of power in the British Isles. At the same time, the Vatican looked upon the Irish plea with sympathy. The Church knew that Catholic survival on the island depended on the rebels' victory. Jesuit priests were sent. Papal messages passed between clans, and with that, the war took on a new dimension. It was no longer just about land. It was about the spiritual salvation of an entire people. The Irish felt that hope. In the villages, people whispered about Spanish ships arriving with supplies, weapons, and golden crosses. Children drew flags with castles and lions. Monks re-emerged from caves with books rescued from flames. It was as if time itself had paused for a moment, letting faith fill the space left by pain. And in every prayer now there was one more word: Spain. O'Neill, in turn, prepared himself. He knew foreign aid brought both risk and possibility. A Spanish presence in Ireland would also be a new occupation, a new kind of dependence. But at that moment, with the English reinforcing their troops and building military roads across Ulster, there was no alternative. Hope needed anchors, and the sea needed allies. Small shipments began to arrive, not in fleets, but in discreet vessels. Weapons, gunpowder, doctors, clergymen. Each landing was silent, carried out under moonlight, the sound of waves masking the steps of boots on sand. Spain still hesitated to send a full army, but it signaled. And for a people at war, signals were enough to keep fighting. Behind the scenes, however, the risks were growing. England monitored every movement carefully. News that the rebels were allying with Spain alarmed royal advisors. The war was no longer just internal. It had become a continental battlefield. The fear that a new Spanish armada might anchor on Irish soil led London to accelerate its response. The English monarchy knew if Spain truly sent large-scale troops, Ireland might slip from its grasp forever. So England reinforced its ports, dispatched more ships, and prepared new campaigns to extinguish the flames of resistance. But beneath all the movement, anxiety grew. They now faced more than Irishmen armed with knives and spears. They faced a people whose faith had been rekindled and who carried foreign hope in their hearts. And so, while England's eyes turned toward the sea and Ireland's eyes looked to the south, the horizon grew heavier. Soon it would no longer be just clans, forests, and mud. There would be crossed flags, mixed languages, invisible fleets arriving at dawn. The war, silent for so long, had begun to speak in different tongues, but what it said was still Ireland. It was winter in Ireland, a bitter winter, with low skies, raging seas, and roads swallowed by mud. The hills looked grey, and the bare trees resembled arms raised in silent plea. Yet beneath that austere landscape, a breath of hope moved through the fields. The Spanish had arrived. After years of promises, negotiations, emissaries and prayers, ships bearing the Golden Cross finally anchored in the south of the island, in Kinsale, County Cork. For the first time, the wind seemed to blow in favour of the Irish cause, and time itself appeared to pause, watching what would happen next. It was December 1601, nearly 9 years after the rebellion had begun. The war had already left villages in ruins, fields abandoned, and thousands dead. But now, beneath heavy, clouded skies, more than 3,000 Spanish soldiers landed, led by Don Juan del Aguila. They brought weapons, supplies, faith, and above all they brought international legitimacy to the Irish uprising. Their presence was not only military, it was symbolic. It confirmed that Ireland was not alone. But the chosen landing site, Kinsale, was far from Gaelic strongholds. It lay at the island's southern tip, distant from the Ulster fortresses and the forests where O'Neill and O'Donnell held their ground. For the Spanish, it was a strategic harbour to control, but for the Irish it became a race against time. Upon hearing of the landing, Hugh O'Neill and Hugh Roe O'Donnell set out immediately with their armies. They crossed ice-covered valleys, raging rivers, frozen paths. Hundreds died along the way, yet they marched on, because they knew this was the moment, perhaps the last. On the other side, the English understood what was at stake. Lord Mountjoy, commander of the royal forces, quickly organized a siege around Kinsale. The Spanish, expecting swift reinforcements from their Irish allies, found themselves trapped between the sea and a professional army. Now, time turned against them. Relentless rain, sickness, cold, mistrust between languages. With each passing day, the pressure grew. When O'Neill and O'Donnell finally approached, they brought with them the last embers of Gaelic strength. Exhausted, starving men, but with fire in their eyes. The plan was simple and bold: launch a surprise night attack, break the siege and liberate the Spanish. It would be a double victory, military and symbolic. The heart of English power in Ireland would be shattered, and the world would witness it. But the chosen dawn, cold, damp and shrouded, conspired against them. Communication between the Irish and Spanish failed. Darkness confused their movements. O'Neill's troops arrived late. The English, alerted, responded swiftly. The battlefield turned into a swamp of muffled cries in the fog, horses stuck in mud, weapons jammed by water, commanders separated from their men, and in just a few hours, the dream collapsed. Kinsale was lost. The defeat was not only tactical, it was spiritual. There, on the muddy slopes of southern Ireland, the hope kindled over a decade was extinguished by the icy wind of the Atlantic. Don Juan del Aguila, wounded and disheartened, surrendered and accepted repatriation. The Spanish boarded ships back home, carrying not only their weapons, but also the weight of a broken promise. And for the Irish, what remained was silence. A heavy silence, almost sacred, like a funeral. Hugh O'Donnell, consumed by guilt and the weight of defeat, left Ireland shortly after. He went to Spain in search of more aid, but he never returned. He died in Salamanca, surrounded by mourning and memories. They say his final breaths were in Gaelic, asking forgiveness from his men. Hugh O'Neill, more experienced and restrained, withdrew to the north, where he still held partial control. But even he knew, Kinsale was not just a battle. It was a warning. From that moment, the rebellion began to lose momentum. Desertions increased. Villages, once fervent, fell into fear. Hunger returned. The English reclaimed control with brutality, and the bards, quietly, began to sing of Kinsale as one sings a lament, not of defeat, but of a destiny nearly achieved. Even so, even beneath the shadow of tragedy, Ireland did not surrender immediately. For the Gaelic people, even pain holds pride. Kinsale was the turning point, a whisper of glory lost to the wind. But centuries later, it still echoes through the hills, a reminder that there was once a time when freedom was so near, you could almost touch it. There is something deeply moving about dying far from the land where you were born, especially when that land was defended with every fiber of your body, every word from your heart, every breath of your spirit. That was the end of Hugh O'Donnell. Not on the battlefield he had always sought, but in a foreign bed, surrounded by voices he could barely understand, in a city that did not know his legends, far from the wind that danced over the hills of Tyrconnell. After the defeat at Kinsale, O'Donnell did not give up. Young, impulsive, but driven by a sense of mission that bordered on the sacred, he departed for Spain, not out of ambition, not to escape, but to try one last time, to bring to the feet of King Philip III the desperate plea of a bleeding people. Ireland was still fighting, still resisting, and he, as a true son of the northern forests, believed the tide could still turn, with more ships, more men, more faith. The journey was long, undertaken with a wounded body and a shattered soul. Along the way, records show his health deteriorated. Fever consumed him, and still, when he arrived in La Coruña, he did not rest. He traveled overland to Valladolid and later to Salamanca, where the Spanish court received him with honor, but hesitation. The loss at Kinsale had altered Madrid's plans. Supporting Ireland now seemed more a liability than an opportunity. The days of promises felt distant. O'Donnell saw it. Still, he tried. He sent letters, begged for audiences, pored over maps with Spanish commanders, but the answer was always postponed. The Spanish Empire, entangled in wars on multiple fronts, hesitated to gamble again on a cause that, to many, already felt lost. For Hugh Roe, the waiting became unbearable. It was in Salamanca, the city of golden stone and narrow streets, that his body finally gave in. The fevers, perhaps worsened by poison, as some suggest, or simply by utter exhaustion, dragged him into a state of delirium. There, among monks and interpreters, in a bed that wasn't his, the hero of Donegal began to fade, slowly, like the tide pulling away without a sound. They say that in his final days he spoke to himself, calling out for his clan brothers, that he whispered Gaelic songs from childhood, that he asked for news of the northern forests, the cold rivers, the hidden altars. No one knows his last words, but we know he died in silence, and for someone like him, silence said everything. O'Donnell's death was felt across Ireland like a prophecy. Even without knowing the details, the clans understood. The youthful heart of the rebellion had stopped beating. Bards composed elegies, monks lit candles, and mothers, as they put their children to sleep, began to tell stories of a warrior who escaped from prison, crossed mountains, defied kingdoms, and died far away but free. His body was buried on Spanish soil, but his spirit never left Ireland. The hills of Tyrconnell still carry his name. The cold waters of the lake still echo his bravery. And on the quietest nights, when fog cloaks the earth like a mourning veil, the elders say you can hear, far away, the sound of Hugh Rowe's footsteps returning home. And perhaps in some way he did return, not with fleets or battalions, but as memory, as symbol, as proof that there was once a time when the youth of a people stood against the world in the name of their homeland, and lost, but not in vain. What is left for a man who fought for everything, and lost? What stirs in the heart of someone who once saw the blazing flame of hope, shined in the peak of resistance, and was slowly surrounded by silence, exhaustion, and abandonment? So ends the journey of Hugh O'Neill, not with a sword raised or a final battle cry, but with a quiet gesture, made beneath the cold stone ceiling of a monastery, before men who did not speak his tongue, but understood his surrender. It was the year 1603. The war had dragged on for nearly a decade. Ireland bled from within. Fields once green and fertile had been burned, entire villages emptied, hidden churches left abandoned, paths once sung by bards now silent. Hunger walked the valleys, and the people weary no longer saw salvation in the fight, only an endless cycle of loss. Hugh O'Neill, the strategist, the diplomat, the lord once educated among the English who had become their fiercest enemy, now faced perhaps the most invincible foe of all, time. He still had soldiers. He still held a northern stronghold, but the world had changed. Spain had withdrawn. Internal support had faded. Allies were falling one by one, and in London, the iron-willed Elizabeth the Fun was gone. The throne now belonged to James I, a Scottish king more familiar with Celtic peoples, and who promised, at least formally, a new approach to the Irish question. O'Neill hesitated. For months he refused to sign anything, to kneel, to yield. But deep inside he knew the time had come. A nation is not built solely on battles, but also on survival, and his people, exhausted, needed to breathe. So, quietly, he prepared his surrender. The chosen place was Mellifont Abbey in County Louth, a place of silence, of ancient stone, of crosses worn down by time. There, before representatives of the crown, Hugh O'Neill removed his warrior's cloak, laid down his arms, and signed the Treaty of Mellifont. No fiery speeches were recorded, no applause, only the sound of pen on paper, and the soft creak of wood beneath the feet of a man who had just ended not only a war, but an entire era. With the treaty, O'Neill retained part of his lands. He received official pardon. He regained the title of Earl of Tyrone, but in return, he renounced the Ireland he had dreamed of. He had to accept English law. He had to swear loyalty to a distant king. He had to live in peace, but a peace shaped by others, imposed by those he had fought for 10 long years. To some it was an act of wisdom, to others of resignation. But for O'Neill, perhaps it was simply an act of love. Love for a land he could no longer liberate but might still preserve if he could stop the blood from flowing. In the months that followed, he continued to live in Tyrone, walking the ruins of fortresses, visiting old allies, watching the slow disappearance of all he had known. The Gaelic language banned from schools, the Catholic faith pushed to the margins, the forests cut down, the clans broken. It was like witnessing the fading of a song he had once sung loudly, now vanishing note by note, in the mist of the new English order. And yet, His name still carried weight, still inspired fear. Many English officials knew that he was a man who could, if he wished, reignite the war. But O'Neill chose not to, and that decision, not to fight again, may have been his final way of protecting what remained. Deep down, his surrender was not submission. It was farewell. Like a man placing his hands on the soil, closing his eyes and whispering to the ground, "I tried." And perhaps the land answered, not with words, but with the silence of roots still growing, even when the branches no longer bloom. Some departures need no applause, no public farewells to become eternal. There are moments when the simple echo of footsteps resounds louder than any cannon. And so it was with the episode that history would forever remember as the Flight of the Earls. There were no battles, no speeches, just a grey dawn, a silent harbour, and a few boats sailing away, carrying with them the last guardians of an Ireland that no longer existed. It was the year 1607, 4 years after the official end of the 9 Years' War. Peace imposed by force reigned like an uncomfortable veil over a wounded island. English laws were spreading, schools now taught in English. Catholic priests, when found, were imprisoned or killed. And the old Gaelic clans, the O'Donnells, the Maguires, the O'Neills, now lived as shadows of themselves, caught between the memory of what they once were and the weight of surviving in a world that no longer belonged to them. Hugh O'Neill, still Earl of Tyrone, lived with relative dignity, but his influence was monitored, his steps watched, and above all, his spirit tired. With each new decree from the crown, with every new law that further restricted the freedom of his people, he saw more clearly that what remained of Gaelic Ireland was dying, not in battle, but in quiet oblivion. So, in secret, he decided to leave, not as a fugitive, but as an exile, like one who chooses not to watch the final breath of a civilization. At his side were other noblemen, Rory O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell, and several lesser lords, poets, priests, and family. Together, they were the last elite of the old Gaelic order, the last to fluently speak the language of the ancients, to understand the bard's verses, to carry the blood of Celtic kings. Their departure took place quietly at the port of Rathmullen on the northern coast. At dawn they boarded small ships bound for continental Europe, seeking refuge in Spain, the Low Countries, or Rome, where faith still found sanctuary. They carried few belongings, but in their hearts they bore 1,000 years of tradition, battles, and bloodlines. As their ships vanished into the foggy horizon, those few who knew did not cheer. They wept, silently, as if that image of old lords departing on fragile boats embodied what was happening to all of Ireland, the ancestral soul of the island leaving its own body. With the Earls' departure, the power of the clans was officially dismantled. The English crown used the political vacuum to initiate one of the most radical colonization processes in Irish history, the plantation of Ulster. Lands belonging to the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, and others were seized and redistributed to Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. New villages were founded, new churches, new maps. The land was redrawn, as if memory could be erased with lines and walls. But what the officials didn't understand is that Irish memory does not die with documents. It survives in songs, in prayers, in stories whispered to children, in stones left unmoved, in names never forgotten. And the flight of the Earls, though a political ending, became a symbolic birth. The beginning of Ireland in exile, physical, spiritual, and cultural. The bards, stripped of their patrons, continued composing in secret. The priests now hunted, celebrated Mass beneath the stars. And mothers, as they laid their children to sleep, told stories of a time when there were kings on the hills, and warriors who fought not for titles, but for the honor of the land. Today, the names of those who left are carved into monuments, but perhaps their greatest monument is the silence they left behind, a silence that is not absence, but reverence, the silence of an Ireland never fully conquered, only wounded. And in the soft sway of the sea, where those ships once sailed into the unknown, the wind still carries from time to time an ancient whisper, as if saying, they did not die, they became song. With the Earls' ships crossing the horizon, and the Gaelic clans either scattered or subdued, England saw before it an unprecedented opportunity to reconfigure Ireland in its own image, not just to dominate, but to redesign, to erase the traces of the old Celtic order, to redraw maps, rename places, reassign land ownership, and the instrument chosen for this was the coldest and most effective, the pies plantation. The word itself, soft to the ear, concealed a deep process of systematic colonization. Beginning in Ulster, the northernmost province and the most resistant, the Crown confiscated vast tracts of land from the old clans and distributed them to Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. Loyal men, families who brought with them a new language, a new faith, a new way of life. And with them came fences, contracts, walled towns, new names. Where once there were forests and stone villages, there now stood neatly ordered plantations, Anglican churches and town squares shaped like chessboards. This was the new Ireland, not conquered by war, but planted, with laws, settlements and surveillance. The surviving Irish families were relocated or evicted. Many came to live on the edges of the very fields they once owned. They became servants on their own soil. Customs were banned, language mocked, music labeled subversive, and religion turned into a crime. Schools began teaching in English. The Bible, now in Protestant form, replaced the ancient Latin liturgies. Even names were altered. O'Neill became O'Neill. Macdomnile turned into MacDonald. Small changes which, to the Crown, symbolized progress. But to the Irish it felt like losing their face. The new ruling class was foreign. The old castles were now occupied by administrators from London or Edinburgh. The laws were enforced by judges who barely understood the moral codes of the locals. Land, once divided by clan lineage and oral pacts, was now measured with rulers and sold in lots, like merchandise. And in the hearts of the people, there was a profound sense of displacement without travel. They still lived in Ireland, but no longer in an Ireland that belonged to them. And yet, memory persisted. It hid, but it did not die. The elders still told stories in hushed voices. The youth learned the forbidden tongue in the dark of night. The hunted priests celebrated mass on remote hills, where ordinary stones became sacred altars. And the bards, even without patrons, composed songs that traveled through generations, some sorrowful, others full of rage, but all saying in one way or another, "We are still here." The Irish identity, suffocated by the structure of the plantations, did not vanish. It simply changed form. It survived in the details, in the stitching of a skirt, in the name given to a daughter, in the eyes of a man who remained silent in English but shone when he heard an old melody. It became silent resistance, a wall built of memory, where each stone was a word preserved. Meanwhile, England celebrated. The plan seemed to work. Ireland appeared more organized, more integrated into the empire, but what the administrators failed to see was that they had only constructed the surface of a new country. Beneath it flowed a subterranean river of memory, sorrow, and fire, a river that would run silently for centuries until it rose again. The plantations left visible marks, in cities, in surnames, in political borders that still shape the geography. But they also left an invisible scar, the wound of a people who had experienced the deepest of losses, yet refused to forget. And so Ireland entered the 17th century not as a defeated nation, but as a living soul within a foreign body. A soul that slept, but not in peace, because dreams, once turned into memory, never die. They simply wait. There are wars that end with treaties, dates, and history books. And there are wars that continue in silence, in the eyes of those who remember, in songs passed down through generations, in tears that fall without words. The 9 Years' War, officially concluded on paper in 1603, never truly ended. It lived on for centuries in the soul of Ireland, like an ember that glows without flame, like a dream that returns night after night, like the echo of something that once was and still longs to be. The conflict marked the end of Gaelic Ireland, the land of clans, bards, Brehon laws, forests surrounding castles, and ancestral names spoken with pride. But it also marked the birth of something new, a national awareness, a shared pain, a desire for sovereignty that would never fade, no matter how much the borders shifted, how many times the language was banned, or how many churches were burned. In the centuries that followed, Ireland would face many other wounds: failed rebellions, devastating famines, forced migrations, political and religious divisions. But in every new chapter, The memory of the 9 Years' War reappeared as an invisible foundation, the moment when the entire country, though fractured, dared to dream with one voice. The figure of Hugh O'Neill, once branded a traitor, came to be remembered as a patriot. The ambushes in the forests became symbols of courage. The exiled bards became the first historians of a wounded memory, and their songs, once seen as laments, turned into anthems. Every word written by a Catholic chronicler, every prayer whispered in Gaelic, every place name preserved against the will of the conquerors, all of it was and still is resistance. And in more recent times, when Ireland finally gained its independence, part of that past returned as a root. Schools began once again to teach the forgotten names. Children heard the tales of the clans. The language once forbidden was revived, and with it the island's voice. But not everything was restored. The divisions planted by war and plantation remained in parts of the territory. The north, where the seeds of the 9 Years' War were watered with blood, continued to be a stage for identity and political struggles. The scar still hurts, but even pain, when acknowledged, can teach. Today, as one walks through lands like Tyrone, Donegal, or the fields around Kinsale, there is something in the air that cannot be explained. A presence, a silence full of meaning. The stones of ancient castles may have crumbled, but their shadows still stand. The names of clans are still etched in gravestones, plaques, and songs, and in the winds that sweep across the island, it seems the voices of the past still whisper, because Ireland, even after everything, never stopped dreaming. And every old dream that survives the passage of time becomes a prophecy. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine yourself walking along the trails of the north, among soft mist and centuries-old trees. Feel the earth beneath your feet. Listen to the whispers of rain on the branches and hear, deep within, the slow beating of the island's heart. It still beats. It still sings. It still waits. Because some loves for the land do not end in war. They simply fall asleep until they awaken again.